Proud of probably the people that I've got to work with over the years, especially the recent years. A lot of real talented people that I've admired myself for a very long time.
What happens when a voice becomes more famous than the man who owns it? For decades, the music industry has worshipped image over emotion, leaving behind the voices that dared to feel too much. Awards, remasters, nostalgia tours, none have fixed the cultural amnesia that erases sincerity in favor of spectacle. But one name still echoes from the shadows: Michael McDonald, a voice that once stopped time, a legacy quietly stolen, and now unexpectedly resurfacing. Because at 73, he's not just still here, he's revealing a truth the industry never wanted you to see. Try not to gasp when you see him today. He sang like someone who had already lost everything. There's a quality to Michael McDonald's voice that defies logic. It's not just soulful, it's wounded. Every note sounds like a confession, every phrase like the final plea of a man who knows redemption is slipping through his fingers. His voice didn't shimmer, it bled. In the mid-1970s, as American pop culture chased spectacle and flash, McDonald emerged as an anomaly. He was quiet, pale, bearded, hunched over a keyboard with the posture of a monk and the humility of a ghost. But when he opened his mouth, time did something strange. It didn't stop. It contracted. His voice reached into the past while calling out from the future. It felt ancient and urgent at once. At first, nobody knew who he was. His vocals would appear uncredited, haunting songs by other artists like a phantom. People asked, "Who is that?" when they heard Peg by Steely Dan or Ride Like the Wind by Christopher Cross. The answer was always the same: Michael McDonald. But his name stayed in the margins, and he didn't fight it. Fame was never the plan. He was just there to serve the music. But the industry doesn't allow secrets for long. Eventually, his voice became too recognizable to hide. It was a velvet freight train, soft but unstoppable. Producers began using him like a seasoning, a one-man gospel choir layered over the chorus of a track to give it weight. And for a while, it worked. His voice became the sound of longing, the sound of sophistication, the sound of hits. But while the sound soared, the man behind it became more and more obscured. McDonald was never the star of his own narrative. He was the song doctor, the studio savior, the man called in when magic needed to happen. And for years, he said yes. Yes to fixing, yes to helping, yes to lending his soul to tracks that weren't his own. Then something strange happened. The world fell in love with the voice, but forgot the man. Today, at 73, Michael McDonald walks through a world that seems to have erased the myth it once built around him. Viral articles treat him like a punchline. Photos of his aging face are framed in disbelief. Try not to gasp when you see him now. But maybe the world should be gasping for a different reason. Because what we've done to Michael McDonald, what the industry did, what we did as a culture, isn't just erasure. It's betrayal. A man gave us everything he had, and we buried him beneath the very sound that made him unforgettable. His career began, fittingly, in the background. Michael McDonald's early years were spent drifting through Los Angeles in the 1970s, playing piano in clubs, singing backup where he could, auditioning for bands that didn't want another soul singer. He was white, yes, but his voice wasn't. It carried the DNA of Ray Charles, the yearning of Marvin Gaye, the phrasing of gospel choirs from long-forgotten churches. It didn't belong to any one genre or era. In 1974, Steely Dan came calling. The band, known for its musical perfectionism and cold detachment, was an unlikely match for McDonald's burning sincerity. But his voice cut through their jazz rock puzzles with startling clarity. He sang backup on Bad Sneakers, then Any Major Dude, and most famously, Peg. His harmonies didn't just support the track, they altered it. They gave it blood. Still, he was uncredited. Still, he was invisible. That changed when the Doobie Brothers found themselves in crisis. Their lead singer, Tom Johnston, was sidelined with health issues during a crucial tour. The band needed someone, anyone, to fill in temporarily. McDonald was suggested, mostly because he was available. He was never supposed to be a permanent fixture, but the moment he took the mic, the band changed forever. Suddenly, the raw boogie rock of the Doobies transformed into something smoother, more refined. McDonald brought complex chords, jazz voicings, and a vocal tone that dripped with melancholy. It didn't just alter their sound, it revolutionized it. With him at the helm, they released Takin' It to the Streets, followed by Minute, and then the Grammy-sweeping What a Fool Believes. They weren't a band anymore. They were a brand. And McDonald was the product, but not everyone cheered. Hardcore fans called it a sellout. Critics accused McDonald of sanitizing the group's edge. Too soft, they said. Too polished. Some even used the term whitewashed soul. But none of that stopped the record sales. McDonald had made the Doobies relevant again, profitable again. Still, behind the scenes, he was uneasy. He hadn't joined the band to take over. He was never meant to be the voice of their second act. But success doesn't ask permission. It rewrites the script mid-performance, and by the time McDonald looked up, he was center stage. Whether he wanted it or not, he was crowned with a title he never asked for. Yacht rock, a genre named decades after its peak, was meant to mock. It was coined by internet comedians as a joke, a tongue-in-cheek way to describe the polished, smooth, radio-friendly sounds of late 70s soft rock. Hall & Oates, Toto, Christopher Cross, Kenny Loggins, and always, at the center, Michael McDonald. The label was retroactive. The mockery was present day. It reduced an entire style to a stereotype. Men in Hawaiian shirts, sipping cocktails on million-dollar boats, crooning into the sunset about heartbreak. McDonald, who had grown up working class in St. Louis and worshipped black gospel music, didn't fit the image, but his voice was the crown jewel. His collaborations with Kenny Loggins, his solo hits like I Keep Forgettin', and his countless features on other artists' tracks gave the genre its defining sound. And while others leaned into the joke, McDonald didn't laugh. Because to him, it wasn't a joke. Those songs, his songs, were sacred. They were crafted with spiritual precision. Every vocal run was a plea, every lyric a confession. But the world didn't hear that anymore. They heard background music for dentists' offices. They heard nostalgia without substance. They heard parody. McDonald watched it all happen from the sidelines. His name became a meme. His vocal style was exaggerated into a caricature. Exaggerated falsetto, eyes closed, head swaying. He was impersonated more than admired. And slowly, the reverence faded. Critics began to revise history. They called his music soft as an insult. His emotional vulnerability was framed as emasculation. His commitment to craft was dismissed as corniness. But behind the ridicule was something darker, a refusal to acknowledge that McDonald's greatest sin was making music that felt too much. He didn't chase radio trends. He didn't reinvent himself as a pop chameleon. He just kept singing the truth, in the only voice he had. And as the laughter grew louder, McDonald began to retreat, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew something the world had forgotten. That sincerity is the easiest thing to mock and the hardest thing to fake. It's hard to count what's been stolen when the theft is invisible. For Michael McDonald, the music industry was never just a stage. It was a machine. Behind the polished vinyl and platinum plaques were lawyers, middlemen, and gatekeepers. And for someone like McDonald, whose instincts leaned toward trust and creative purity, that machine was quietly brutal. By the late 1970s, McDonald's voice had become the industry's worst-kept secret. Producers whispered his name in studio halls. A backup vocal from him could transform a mediocre track into a radio darling. Artists sought him out, not for collaboration, but for his essence. And McDonald, always eager to be useful, rarely said no. But saying yes came at a cost. The contracts were murky. Royalties were miscalculated or never calculated at all. There were albums where McDonald's harmonies defined the chorus, yet his name was nowhere in the liner notes. In one infamous case, his vocal take was used to teach another singer how to phrase the melody. But then, the producers decided McDonald sounded better. They kept his take and never told him. He didn't fight it. Not then. He assumed someone else was handling the details. That was the tragedy. McDonald's voice was legendary, but his business sense was average. He wasn't greedy. He was grateful, and that made him exploitable. There were promises made in studio hallways. We'll add you in post. We'll talk to your rep. Don't worry, the check's coming. But checks bounced. Credits disappeared. Careers launched off the back of his contributions, while McDonald watched from the sidelines, clapping politely. Even the major hits, songs he co-wrote or carried with his vocals, were dissected by record labels looking for ways to minimize his ownership. Shared royalties were diluted, points were erased, and McDonald, too humble to raise hell, quietly bore the weight. Later, he would admit, "I was just happy to be part of the music. I didn't think much about who got what, but others did." And while McDonald kept lending his voice, the world kept taking it, cutting it up, repackaging it, layering it behind other artists, and selling it without his name attached. His voice became a ghost in the machine, recognizable, ubiquitous, anonymous. Decades later, when journalists tried to piece together a full accounting of McDonald's studio work, they ran into a wall. Too many sessions, too few receipts, and far too many songs that sounded exactly like him, but were never documented. The voice had been everywhere, but the man had been paperless. Michael McDonald didn't look like a pop star. He didn't act like one either. In a decade defined by image, leather pants, choreographed videos, televised excess, McDonald remained stubbornly ordinary. He wore loose shirts and tinted glasses. He kept his hair long and his gaze downward. He rarely smiled in photos, not because he was moody, but because he didn't think of himself as a spectacle. But that made him an outlier. And in the 80s, outliers got left behind. His 1982 solo debut, If That's What It Takes, was a critical and commercial success. Songs like I Keep Forgettin' fused R&B, pop, and jazz with emotional precision. The voice was there. The vulnerability was there. The heartbreak was authentic. But the industry wasn't satisfied. They wanted more. More hits. More exposure. More image. And McDonald didn't deliver. He refused to play the game. Refused to repackage himself into something he wasn't. While others leaned into synthesizers and shoulder pads, McDonald stayed grounded in analog soul. He wrote slow songs when fast was fashionable, spiritual songs when lust was trending, songs about absence, about failure, about quiet regret. The result was inevitable. Radio moved on. MTV barely played his videos. Younger listeners shrugged him off as a leftover from another era. Even within the industry, executives began whispering, "Is he still relevant? Is he still marketable?" To McDonald, the questions made no sense. He hadn't changed. The world had. By the early 90s, he was releasing albums that barely charted. His label support weakened. Promotional budgets dried up. Once the voice that launched hits, he was now a footnote, beloved by a dwindling group of loyal fans, ignored by everyone else. But the worst part wasn't irrelevance. It was misinterpretation. His sincerity was rebranded as cheesiness. His vulnerability was seen as weakness. The emotional truth he poured into every verse was now an aesthetic punchline, a shorthand for soft, for dated, for something your parents listened to. And through it all, McDonald never lashed out. He never reinvented himself. He never chased approval. He just kept writing, kept singing. He was never made for the spotlight. But that didn't mean he deserved to be forgotten. There was no final flameout, no scandal, no public breakdown. Michael McDonald didn't crash. He drifted. By the mid-1990s, The voice that once defined an era had vanished from the charts, not because it failed, but because the world had changed its tastes. Music had become louder, edgier, darker. Nirvana, Tupac, Alanis. The new generation didn't want smooth. They wanted real. But McDonald was real. The problem was, his version of real wasn't angry or ironic. It was wounded, reverent, earnest, and in a decade obsessed with tearing things down, sincerity became a liability. So he stepped back. He played jazz festivals, lent vocals to obscure projects, released albums with little fanfare. He focused on his family, on his faith, on living quietly, and for a time, that was enough. But then, the laughter began. Parody skits on late-night television, YouTube impressions, viral videos that exaggerated his voice to absurdity. Suddenly, McDonald wasn't a legend. He was a character, a symbol of dad music, a joke. It stung. Not because it hurt his ego, but because it cheapened something sacred. The voice that once held the nation in thrall was now reduced to a meme, and with every mock impression, the original grew more invisible. When asked about the parodies, McDonald always took the high road. He smiled, said he was flattered, said it was all in good fun. But those close to him knew better. They saw the wince behind the laugh. The man who once carried a generation's pain in his voice now carried the burden of being misunderstood. In interviews, his tone became quieter, more cautious. He spoke less about legacy, more about gratitude, about surviving the ride, about being lucky to still sing. But make no mistake, this wasn't contentment. It was resignation. McDonald didn't fade because he had nothing left to say. He faded because no one was listening the same way. And as his voice aged, grew raspier, more fragile, it became a haunting reminder, not of what was lost, but of what we refused to honor when we had it. He stood among giants, but they were made of plastic. As the years wore on, Michael McDonald watched his contemporaries become relics and brands. They curated their legacies like museums, licensing their images, signing exclusive deals, re-releasing anniversary editions with gold foil and bonus tracks. The music industry, ever hungry for nostalgia, turned aging legends into marketable deities. McDonald never joined them. He had no interest in rebranding himself as an icon. He didn't want his career sealed in amber. He wanted to keep living it, creating new work, evolving quietly. But the industry didn't want evolution. It wanted myth, and worse, it wanted control. What McDonald got instead were broken promises. One label promised a revival, a major marketing push for his next solo album, a legacy act relaunch, they called it. The budget vanished before the record even dropped. A tour was planned, then canceled. There were always explanations, shifts in strategy, changes in leadership, bad timing. Behind the scenes, executives who once fought to sign him now forgot to return his calls. Then there were the reissues, old Doobie Brothers albums remastered and re-released, sometimes with his vocals centered, sometimes minimized, depending on who was in charge. Even the band's own legacy became a battlefield of competing narratives. McDonald never fought for control. That wasn't his way, but he watched, quietly, as his place in history was edited in real time. He was even shut out of projects designed to celebrate him. Compilation albums titled Best of Yacht Rock featured his voice prominently, but he was rarely consulted, credited, or compensated properly. His sound had become public domain, a vibe, not a person. And so he retreated. Not out of bitterness, but exhaustion. He stopped expecting recognition, stopped chasing fairness, stopped believing the industry would ever repay the creative debt it owed him. Instead, he focused inward, on his music, his wife Amy, his children, his home studio. He was surrounded by hollow monuments, gold records on office walls, streaming playlists bearing his name, but none of them told the truth. None of them said what he had sacrificed, what had been taken from him, or how deeply the theft ran. Because Michael McDonald didn't just lose visibility, he lost authorship. The industry had used his voice to build empires. but it never gave him the blueprint. The voice was still there, maybe a little softer, a little raspier, but unmistakably his. A sound carved from gospel pain and Midwestern longing. The same voice that once soared over stadiums now floated through smaller venues, church stages, aging jazz clubs. And when he sang, people still cried. It was never about the crowd size. It was about the communion. A room full of strangers who, for 3 minutes at a time, believed in something again. Love, regret, grace. McDonald gave it to them like a benediction. But between those moments, there was silence. The kind of silence that only settles over someone who's been edited out of their own legacy. McDonald was never truly forgotten, but he was misremembered. His voice existed in thousands of songs, commercials, and cultural references, but the person behind it had become a specter. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, they often looped back to the same questions. What's it like being a meme? Do you mind the parodies? How do you feel about being the king of yacht rock? No one asked about the music anymore, about the stories, about the why. That, perhaps, was the deepest cut. To be heard, but never listened to. Admired, but never understood. There were private costs, too. Anxiety, depression, long stretches of self-doubt. He spoke candidly, years later, about feeling adrift. Like a man whose only tool was a voice the world had already decided was outdated. He wasn't bitter. That word didn't fit him. What he carried was something quieter, a soft grief. Not just for himself, but for a time when music meant more than numbers, more than nostalgia, more than memes. Still, he sang, and in those quiet, reverent performances, often unrecorded, sometimes unnoticed, he rediscovered something holy. The voice wasn't his career, it was his calling. It didn't belong to record labels, it didn't belong to critics, it belonged to the ache itself. The haunting of Michael McDonald wasn't that he was forgotten. It was that he had never truly been seen. The world didn't forget all at once. It happened the way the tide recedes, not in a single wave, but in slow, imperceptible inches. One moment, Michael McDonald's voice was everywhere. On the radio, in movie soundtracks, on platinum records that played endlessly in cars, malls, and living rooms across America. And then, the silence began. His name stopped appearing in music magazines. His new albums were released with barely a whisper of coverage. The Grammys, once eager to celebrate his artistry, passed him over without mention. Even his guest appearances on other artists' tracks went uncredited, unnoticed, quietly erased from the narrative. And then came the internet. A new kind of visibility arrived, shallow, viral, unkind. His face began circulating in clickbait headlines, stripped of reverence, framed with digital disbelief. Michael McDonald is 73. Try not to gasp when you see him now. But the gasps weren't for his voice. They weren't for the songs, or the legacy, or the decades of quiet brilliance. They were for his face. His aging, unfiltered, unairbrushed face. The same one that had remained largely anonymous throughout his peak. In his prime, McDonald's voice eclipsed his image. He was heard far more than he was seen. Now, ironically, his image had finally caught up to his fame, but for all the wrong reasons. The internet looked at him not with recognition, but with offense, as if Michael McDonald had committed a sin by aging, as if a voice so timeless, so immortal in sound, had a responsibility to preserve the man in amber, as if he owed us a face frozen in youth, untouched by grief, exhaustion, or the passage of time. But voices are not armor, and time spares no one. What hurt most wasn't the jokes. It wasn't the exaggerations, the meme-ification, or even the stunned comments. It was the implication that Michael McDonald was no longer relevant, that his body, his presence, his being had become useful only as a spectacle. A curiosity passed around to evoke gasps, not respect. A man who once guided millions through heartbreak and healing was now reduced to an aging headline, a digital relic, dissected in comment sections, filtered through cruelty, disguised as surprise. And yet, no one paused to ask the obvious question. Why shouldn't Michael McDonald look like this? He had lived, he had endured, He had weathered decades in an industry that chewed up sincerity and spit out illusion. He had given his soul to a sound that demanded more of him than fame ever returned. He had sung about loss, longing, and grace with a voice forged in pain. And he had kept singing even when the world stopped listening. He had aged as he should. He had grown into the man his music always foreshadowed, thoughtful, worn, deeper in tone but still rich in truth. And while the surface may have changed, silver hair, slower steps, quieter presence, the core remained intact. Michael McDonald never stopped. He still records, still writes, still stands on stage night after night, giving that voice, weathered, beautiful, and real, to anyone still open enough to receive it. And when the room is right, when the moment is honest, something happens. The years disappear, the voice returns, and so does the memory, not just of a sound, but of who we were when we first heard it, and maybe, if we're lucky, who we still are. The world may have forgotten the man, but the voice? The voice still remembers everything. There's a photograph from a recent show, just Michael McDonald, alone at a keyboard, eyes closed. The lighting is soft, the background is dim, as if the world has faded and only the music remains. And the expression on his face isn't performance, it's prayer, not a show of devotion, a real one. The kind uttered in silence, between verses, between breaths. It's a moment suspended in time. A man communing not with an audience, but with something larger, older, more sacred than fame ever was. That's what remains, not the fame. That came and went, as fame always does. Not the fashion. He never cared for it, and it never cared for him. Not the genre, which changed names so many times it eventually laughed at itself. Not the legacy, carefully managed and commodified by others long ago. What's left is the prayer. At 73, Michael McDonald no longer fits any musical category. He's not retro enough for throwback tours, not modern enough for streaming playlists. He's not alternative, not pop, not classic rock, not gospel, not jazz, though he's lived in all those rooms. He floats above them now, untethered, unlabeled. A man defined not by image, but by sound. And not just sound, but feeling. He's no longer chasing relevance. Maybe he never was. What he chases now is resonance. He releases music quietly. No marketing blitz, no viral TikToks. Just new songs. Honest, bare, deeply felt. They slip into the world with little ceremony, sometimes only noticed by the few still listening closely enough to hear them. He collaborates when he wants to. He tours when it feels right. And when he plays, it's not to relive the past. It's to make peace with it. There are no farewell tours on the calendar. No orchestrated memoirs waiting for a Netflix deal. No final statements carved into marble. Just the music. Still arriving. Still speaking. McDonald remains a contradiction. A man whose voice shaped a generation's emotional landscape, but whose name fades quietly into the background. A man whose sound lives in 1,000 songs, yet is treated as a novelty by those who've forgotten or never knew what it once meant. A man mocked by people who've never heard the weight behind his notes. He is both everywhere and nowhere. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Because Michael McDonald was never meant to be a star. Not in the modern sense. He wasn't built for branding, wasn't crafted to be consumed. He was meant to be a vessel. And vessels don't demand applause. They don't sign endorsement deals. They don't chase the spotlight. They carry the weight, gently, humbly, quietly, until the song is done. So what remains of the man behind the mic? Everything. Everything that mattered. Everything the industry tried to bury beneath trends and labels. Everything that was lost when the world stopped listening and started laughing. His voice still echoes, not in the charts, but in the hearts of those who remember what it meant to feel deeply, to listen honestly, to hear a man sing like he was giving something away, something precious. We didn't lose Michael McDonald. We just stopped looking for him. And now that he's 73, we're starting to realize he never really left. We did. But if we listen, really listen, we might just hear him again, before the song ends, while we still can. If a voice this timeless can be erased, what else are we willing to forget? Honoring Michael McDonald isn't just nostalgia, it's a choice to remember what sincerity sounds like, before it's too late. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next time.